The audio recording is 47 minutes long. It was made on the evening of May 24, 2003, in the back room of the Breakers Bar in Kodiak, Alaska, during the 46th Annual Kodiak Crab Festival. The recording equipment was a portable Sony TCDD-10 digital audio tape machine, operated by Joan Merrick, a folklorist employed by the Alaska Humanities Forum for an oral history project titled Voices of the Bering Sea. The speaker on the recording is a 66-year-old retired crab boat captain named Harlan Voss, second-generation Norwegian-American, recently widowed, and until that night, entirely silent about what happened to him 19 years earlier in the Pribilof Canyon. At the 34-minute mark of the recording, the microphone picks up the sound of a chair scraping back at the far end of the table and a second man walking to the window. That sound is the first documented intersection between two separate Bering Sea incidents, but we will return to it in the second report. For now, we are only concerned with what Captain Voss took out of a manila envelope and set on the table halfway through his testimony. 3 35mm photographs. One of them has never been publicly shown. But to understand what those photographs document, we need to go back to the pre-dawn of October 18, 1984. The vessel was the FV Lindsay Marie, a 108-foot house-forward crabber out of Dutch Harbor, rigged for the fall Bristol Bay Red King crab season and operating under a federal commercial fishing permit on file with the National Marine Fisheries Service. Her crew that season numbered 5, including Captain Voss. The fishing grounds were the northern edge of the Pribilof Canyon, a geologic formation cutting into the continental shelf roughly 60 nautical miles north of St. Paul Island. At its deepest point, the canyon drops from the shelf at 150 fathoms to more than 600 fathoms of water, and the shelf break is a documented upwelling zone where cold, nutrient-rich deep water rises along the canyon wall. Biologists at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center have cataloged Pribilof Canyon as one of the most productive benthic ecosystems in the North Pacific and as one of the least biologically surveyed. The canyon hosts species that surface only rarely and die quickly when brought to lower pressure. What the 1984 commercial fleet knew of the canyon came almost entirely from what ended up in their pots. On the morning of October 17th, the Lindsay Marie set a string of 40 king crab pots along the 180-fathom contour of the canyon's northern wall. The pots were standard 7-by-7-foot welded steel frames wrapped in rubber-coated mesh, each weighing approximately 700 pounds dry, each baited with herring and perforated plastic jars mounted at the pot center. They were lowered on buoyed ground lines and left to soak for 18 hours. At 0540 on the morning of October 18th, in pre-dawn darkness and 14-foot seas, the Lindsay Marie began hauling. The first 12 pots came up normal. The Lindsay Marie's deck log, which Voss retained in his personal effects and brought with him to the 2003 festival, records the number and weight of king crab retrieved from each pot in the captain's tight pencil script. Pot 1, 63 keepers. Pot 2, 41. Pot 3, 58. The log entries are clean, routine, and indistinguishable from any other haul. Voss had recorded in 30 years of crabbing. The only unusual entry in the first dozen pots is a notation next to pot 7, where Voss wrote the word bait in the margin and circled it twice. When Joan Merrick asked about that notation in 2003, Voss said that the bait jar in pot 7 had been crushed, not torn open by a crab, but compressed inward as if something large had gripped it. He did not think much of it at the time. Deep water octopus occasionally grip bait jars that hard, and the canyon was known for large octopus. He made the note, reset the jar, and ordered the pot redeployed. The 13th pot was set directly above the deepest point of the canyon's northern wall. When it came up heavy. The hydraulic block that lifts a crab pot from the water is a standard piece of deck machinery on Alaskan crabbers. It operates at roughly 2,500 pounds of lift capacity. well in excess of a pot's wet weight, and its hydraulic pressure is monitored from a gauge mounted on the starboard deck controls. The gauge is the first thing that told the Lindsay Marie's crew that pot 13 was wrong. At the point the pot should have broken the surface, the hydraulic line pressure was reading near maximum. The deckhand operating the block, a 20-year-old Washington State greenhorn named Dale Peterson, who had been on the Lindsay Marie for 6 weeks, radioed the wheelhouse and reported the reading. Voss came out onto the deck. In his testimony, he described the sodium-lit pre-dawn darkness, the 14-foot seas breaking white along the canyon shelf, the sheets of freezing spray crossing the deck lights, and the slow groan of the hydraulic block as it lifted a weight it had not been designed to lift cleanly. He said he looked over the rail and saw the pot still 10 feet below the waterline, rising through black water, and he knew, before it broke the surface, that whatever was in it was not a king crab. The pot cleared the water at 0614, according to the Lindsay Marie's log. Voss's handwritten entry for that moment reads, in its entirety, Pot 13, obstruction. In the 2003 recording, Merrick asked him why he had not written more. He said he could not think of a word that would not get the boat boarded by the Coast Guard within 48 hours. So he wrote obstruction, and he lowered the pot to the deck. The 3 photographs in the manila envelope were taken during the next 43 minutes. What Captain Voss did not know on the morning of October 18, 1984, and what only emerged much later through a Freedom of Information request filed by a University of Alaska graduate student in 1998, is that the Pribilof Canyon shelf break had been flagged by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration 6 months before the Lindsay Marie incident. The flag was for acoustic anomalies. Between April and August of 1984, a passive hydrophone array operated out of the NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory had recorded a series of sub-bass vocalizations along the canyon's northern wall that did not match any cataloged species in the North Pacific Reference Library. The vocalizations were centered in a frequency range between 14 and 22 hertz, below the lower threshold of reliable human hearing, but within the established communication range of large baleen whales such as fin and blue whales. Except the frequency modulation pattern did not match fin or blue whales. It did not match minke, humpback, gray, right, or bowhead whales either. The NOAA technicians who reviewed the recordings classified them as biological origin undetermined and flagged the canyon for additional monitoring. That additional monitoring was scheduled for November 1984. It was never carried out. The funding request was withdrawn in late October without explanation, and the hydrophone data from April through August was reclassified as equipment artifact and sealed. Captain Voss did not know any of this when Pot 13 broke the surface. But the creature in the pot, according to every man who survived that morning, was vocalizing at a frequency they felt in their teeth. The 3 surviving crew members of the Lindsay Marie were interviewed by the Coast Guard on October 19, 1984, in a case report filed under number 84BS1147. The case file was sealed and reclassified within 72 hours of its completion, and the full text of the report did not surface until the Freedom of Information request produced 3 redacted pages in 1999. What the 3 pages show is that the 3 crewmen gave 3 different descriptions of what was in the pot. Dale Peterson, the 20-year-old greenhorn, described a large, pale humanoid figure with a long tail and black eyes. He was the only witness to use the word humanoid. The second crewman, an engineer named Eric Sandstrom, described a marine mammal I could not identify, approximately the length of an adult male human, with a tail like no seal or sea lion I have ever seen. The third crewman, a deckhand named Thomas Everson, refused to describe the creature at all in his initial Coast Guard interview and would not sign his statement. Everson was dead within 4 months of the incident, a single vehicle accident on the Unalaska Road in January 1985, ruled by the Alaska State Troopers as consistent with ice conditions. Voss, for his part, told the Coast Guard in 1984 only that the pot had contained an unidentified marine organism that was subsequently released. 19 years later, on a tape recorder in the back room of a Kodiak bar, he described what he had actually seen. According to the 2003 recording, the creature inside pot 13 was wedged against the bait jar at the center of the pot, pressed into the curved steel of the interior frame by the violence of its own ascent from the canyon floor. Voss described its skin as pale gray, the color of bleached driftwood, streaked wet and catching the sodium deck lights in a way that made it look almost luminous against the dark rubber-coated mesh. Its hair was long, dark, matted, and plastered against its shoulders by the seawater still draining out of the pot. It had a bare torso, and its arms were long and thin, and its hands, and Voss paused on the tape at this point for 9 seconds before continuing. Its hands were webbed. The webbing between the fingers was the same pale gray as the rest of the skin, translucent where the deck light hit it, and the fingers themselves were tipped in dark points that Voss initially mistook for fingernails, but that he later described as something closer to claws. Below the hips, the creature's body did not have legs. Voss used the phrase, "It was the same creature all the way down," and he said the torso merged into a long, thick tail the color of dull gray-green, covered in what looked like leather rather than scales, and ending in 2 wide split flukes that were curled against the far wall of the pot. The face was the hardest part of the testimony for him. He described it as the face of a young man, smooth, unlined, almost boyish, but the eyes were entirely black, without visible irises or whites, and the mouth, when it opened, was full of needle-thin teeth arranged in 2 tight rows. The creature, Voss said, was breathing. He could see its rib cage expanding and contracting through the rubber-coated mesh of the pot in a slow, deliberate rhythm that did not match the fast, shallow breathing of a stranded fish or the gasping of a marine mammal in respiratory distress. It was pulling air, he said, that it did not appear to need. The crew had backed up against the wheelhouse bulkhead the moment the pot settled onto the deck, and none of them moved forward to investigate. Voss ordered the greenhorn, Peterson, to go below and retrieve a 35mm camera he kept in his bunk for insurance documentation purposes. Peterson returned with the camera and took 3 photographs through the rubber-coated mesh of pot 13 from a distance of approximately 6 feet. The first photograph shows the full body of the creature, curled inside the pot against the bait jar. The second photograph shows the creature's left hand pressed against the interior of the mesh, the webbed fingers spread wide, the dark claw tips visible where they made contact with the rubber coating. The third photograph shows the face. It is the third photograph that Voss would not place on the table at the 2003 festival, and that he kept in a separate envelope in his jacket pocket, and that has never, to this day, been publicly shown. Up to this point in the recording, the creature in pot 13 reads as a captured specimen, an unknown marine organism taken from the deep by a commercial crab boat and photographed on deck before some form of release. That is not what the 2003 testimony describes. At approximately the 28-minute mark of the recording, Voss says something that reframes every detail that came before it. He says that during the 43 minutes the creature spent on the deck, it did not struggle against the pot, it did not attempt to escape, and it did not appear to panic. It watched. Specifically, it watched the crew. It tracked them with its head, slowly, deliberately, from one man to the next as they moved along the wheelhouse bulkhead. When Voss spoke on the deck radio to report the incident to the Coast Guard, the creature turned its head to look at the radio. When Peterson raised the camera to take the photographs, the creature turned its head to look at the camera. And when the sub-bass vocalization began, at a frequency the men could not hear, but could feel in their teeth and in the bones of their jaws, the creature was staring directly at Captain Voss. Voss told Joan Merrick in 2003 that the worst thing about those 43 minutes was not the way the creature looked. The worst thing was that it was listening to them. It was listening, and it was making a decision. And after 43 minutes, it made its decision. The scientific analysis of the Lindsay Marie incident, to the extent that any such analysis exists in the public record, consists primarily of a single academic paper published in the Journal of Marine Biology and Ecology in 1989 by a researcher at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The paper is titled Anomalous Bycatch Reports from the Pribilof Canyon, a preliminary taxonomic review, and it compiles 17 commercial fishing incidents between 1978 and 1988 in which crab and longline fishermen reported pulling up organisms that could not be classified against the existing North Pacific species database. The Lindsay Marie incident is case number 9 in the paper. The researcher, a marine biologist named Dr. Elena Kazakov, who retired from the university in 1996, describes the crew's account as morphologically consistent with a hypothetical convergent evolution pathway in which primate skeletal architecture develops alongside cetacean soft tissue adaptations. She stops short of proposing a species classification. She notes that such a pathway has no precedent in the fossil record. She also notes that no fossil record of deep-water humanoid organisms would be expected to survive, because bone preservation in deep abyssal sediment is effectively nil. The absence of evidence, she writes, is not evidence of absence. Dr. Kazakov's paper was withdrawn from the journal in 1991 at the request of its co-authoring institution. No explanation was given. The last 15 minutes of the creature's time aboard the Lindsay Marie are the portion of Voss's testimony that Joan Merrick's field notes describe as delivered in an even voice with unusually long pauses between sentences. At approximately the 30-minute mark of the 1984 incident, by Voss's reckoning, though no written log was kept during those minutes, the sub-bass vocalization began. It was not audible as sound in the conventional sense. Dale Peterson, in a 1985 deposition he gave to his own attorney in the context of an unrelated insurance matter, described it as a feeling in the jaw. Eric Sandstrom, in his Coast Guard interview, described it as a vibration in the teeth that I can still feel. Voss, on the 2003 tape, described it as the kind of sound you feel in your chest when a truck engine idles too close to you in a parking lot, but deeper, lower, and coming from directly in front of him instead of from underneath. He said that as the vocalization continued, the hydraulic block above the deck began to resonate with it, the steel of the pot frame, the steel of the deck plates, and the steel of the crab pot itself, all responding to the frequency in sympathetic vibration. And at that point, the creature began to use its hands. It placed both palms flat against the interior of the mesh, fingers spread, and it pulled. The mesh on a king crab pot is rubber-coated steel wire with a rated tensile strength of approximately 400 pounds per square inch. The steel frame of the pot is 1-inch solid rebar, welded at the joints, rated to withstand pressures in excess of what a 700-pound pot experiences at 180 fathoms of water column. Over the next 8 minutes, according to Voss, the creature bent the framing of pot 13 inward by approximately 6 inches. The Coast Guard inspection of the pot in 1984, documented in the sealed case file, confirmed this. The rebar frame of pot 13 showed deformation consistent with extraordinary applied inward force, and the welded joints at 2 corners had been sheared. The Coast Guard's structural analyst estimated the force required to produce that deformation at between 8 and 1,200 pounds per square inch. For reference, the strongest documented bite force of any living marine animal, the saltwater crocodile, which is not a mammal, but which serves as the upper benchmark for living animal grip strength, is approximately 1,500 pounds per square inch, concentrated through the jaw. The creature on the Lindsay Marie was not using a jaw. It was using its hands. Voss ordered the crew to ready the pot launcher at the starboard rail. The pot launcher is a hydraulic cradle that tips a crab pot over the side of the vessel and drops it back into the water, typically during normal fishing operations when a pot is being reset. Voss's plan was to launch pot 13 with the creature still inside it and let the creature take the pot with it to the bottom of the canyon. It was not a kind plan, but it was, as Voss said on the tape, the only plan that did not involve any of his men getting within arm's reach of the mesh. The crew had the pot launcher rigged and the hydraulic cradle engaged at approximately 0657 by the Lindsay Marie's log. At 0658, while the crew was preparing to rotate the pot onto the launcher, the creature stopped pulling on the mesh. It lowered its hands. It turned its head to look at the pot door. The pot door on a king crab pot is secured from the outside by a heavy steel hook and latch assembly, and the door can be opened by an adult human with 2 hands and a moderate amount of effort. The creature, according to Voss, reached one arm through the rubber-coated mesh at the exact location of the hook, extended 2 clawed fingers, and unlatched the door from the inside. It did this in a single motion. The door swung open. The creature crawled out of the pot onto the wet steel deck, and here Voss's testimony pauses for what Merrick's field notes describe as approximately 12 seconds, and then it dragged itself across the deck in a straight line, past the crew at the wheelhouse bulkhead, past the starboard pot launcher, and over the gunwale into the black water of the Pribilof Canyon. It did not look back. The entire movement, from the moment the creature unlatched the pot door to the moment its tail disappeared below the surface, took somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds. The Lindsay Marie completed her 1984 king crab season without further incident, though the crew did not fish the northern Pribilof Canyon again that year. Voss's Coast Guard interview took place on October 19, 1984, in a secure room at the Coast Guard station in Dutch Harbor, and was conducted by 2 officers whose names appear in the sealed case file, but whose duty assignments, according to records released in the 1999 Freedom of Information request, do not match the Coast Guard's Dutch Harbor roster for that date. Neither officer has been identified. The 3 photographs were confiscated from Dale Peterson during the interview, along with the roll of film from which they had been developed. The photographs Voss brought with him to the 2003 festival were contact prints he had made himself in his own darkroom in November 1984, from negatives he had retained without Peterson's knowledge or the Coast Guard's. He kept them in a locked metal box in the engine room of the Lindsay Marie for 7 years, and then in a safe deposit box at a Dutch Harbor credit union for another 12. Pot 13 itself was retained by the Coast Guard as evidence and never returned to the Lindsay Marie's owners. The deformation of its frame was documented photographically in the sealed case file. Those photographs of the pot, not of the creature, were among the materials released under the 1999 Freedom of Information request, and they show exactly the inward bending Voss described in his testimony. The tensile analysis report attached to the Coast Guard file is marked, in the upper right corner of the cover page, with a classification stamp that does not correspond to any standard Coast Guard document classification system. The researcher who filed the 1999 FOIA request, the graduate student from the University of Alaska, attempted to trace the classification stamp through 3 separate federal records offices and was unable to match it to any known agency. Her thesis advisor suggested she stop asking. She stopped asking. The 3 surviving crewmen of the Lindsay Marie each left commercial fishing within 2 years of the incident. Peterson returned to Washington State and took a job in automotive repair. Sandstrom, the engineer, relocated to Seattle and did not give another interview about the Lindsay Marie for the rest of his life. Everson, a deckhand who refused to describe the creature, died in the January 1985 vehicle accident and was buried in Unalaska. Captain Voss continued running the Lindsay Marie until 1991. He retired to a small house in Kodiak with his wife, Margrethe, whom he had married in 1968, and he did not speak of the 1984 incident to her, or to anyone else for 19 years. Margrethe Voss died of pancreatic cancer on March 3, 2003. 11 weeks later, her husband walked into the back room of the Breakers Bar in Kodiak with a manila envelope containing 3 photographs. Joan Merrick's field notes from that night described Captain Voss as composed throughout, pausing at specific moments, delivering the account as if he had rehearsed it, which he very likely had, in his own head for 19 years. The notes described the reactions of the other men in the room in less detail, with one exception. At the 34-minute mark of the recording, the point at which Voss first described the creature's sub-bass vocalization, Merrick's notes contain a single parenthetical observation. Second speaker, far end of table. Pete I, Longliner, not originally on tonight's interview list, stood at window. Hands visible tremor. Did not return to table for 8 minutes. The second speaker was Pete Ivanof, 50 years old, a retired solo halibut longliner out of Kodiak, who had quit the sea in 1992 and had not been seen on a boat since. He had come to the festival specifically because he had heard Voss was going to be there. He had been waiting, in his own words, 19 years to hear someone else say it out loud. When he finally returned to the table, he asked Joan Merrick if she would turn the recorder back on. He spoke for 29 minutes. 4 years later, he was dead. This is what the tape captured. At the 34-minute mark of the 2003 recording, after Captain Voss described the sub-bass vocalization he had felt in his teeth on the deck of the Lindsay Marie, the microphone captured the sound of a chair scraping back at the far end of the table and a set of footsteps crossing the back room of the Breakers Bar toward the window. The man who stood at that window for 8 minutes was Pete Ivanof, age 50, half Aleut and half Russian by heritage, a third-generation Shelikof Strait longliner who had not been seen on a commercial fishing boat since 1992. His name was not on Joan Merrick's interview list for that evening. He had come to the Kodiak Crab Festival because a cousin in Dutch Harbor had mentioned 2 weeks earlier that a retired crab boat captain named Harlan Voss was scheduled to speak to a folklorist during the oral history sessions at the Breakers. Ivanof had bought a plane ticket from Anchorage to Kodiak the next morning. He had not told his wife why he was going. He had not spoken to Captain Voss before that night, had never met him, had no mutual acquaintances with him beyond the general small community of Alaskan commercial fishermen who had worked Bering Sea grounds in the 1980s and 1990s. But at the 34-minute mark of Voss's testimony, when the captain described a vocalization that made his jawbone vibrate, Pete Ivanof stood up and walked to the window because he had felt the same thing 12 years earlier in the wheelhouse of his own boat for 6 hours. The vessel was the FB Christiana, a 46-foot steel-hulled halibut longliner with a dark green hull and a single square aft wheelhouse, built in Ketchikan in 1974 and purchased by Pete Ivanof in 1986 from a retiring Kodiak fisherman named Nikolai Petrov. Ivanof ran the Christiana alone. He did not employ a deckhand, did not carry a crew, and did not accept company on his sets. The Christiana's vessel registration, on file with the National Marine Fisheries Service, lists a single-operator commercial longline permit for Pacific halibut, with a secondary permit for sablefish deep-water longline, both active through the 1991 fishing year. The fishing ground on the night of February 10th to 11th, 1991, was the Shelikof Strait, the deep, narrow passage between Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, approximately 18 nautical miles southwest of Cape Kodiak. Shelikof Strait is a geologically young marine channel, carved by glacial retreat and deepened by strong tidal currents, and its central basin reaches depths in excess of 300 fathoms. Pacific halibut are a deep-water demersal species, and Ivanof was fishing a longline set at 260 fathoms along the western wall of the Shelikof Basin. The set had gone down at 17:30 on February 10th and was scheduled to be hauled beginning at 0200 February 11th, a standard 8-hour soak for his gear configuration. At the time he began hauling, the Christiana was the only commercial vessel operating in that quadrant of the strait. Coast Guard vessel traffic records for that night, obtained under the same 1999 Freedom of Information request that produced the Lindsay Marie documents, confirmed that no other fishing vessels were within 20 nautical miles of Ivanof's position. He was alone. The weather that night is documented in the National Weather Service's archived Shelikof Strait marine forecast for February 10th to 11th, 1991. Air temperature at the surface was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds were light from the northwest, seas were running 3 to 5 feet, and visibility was rated as unrestricted under a moonless overcast sky. It was, by the standards of a Shelikof winter, a relatively calm night, and a very cold one. Ivanof began hauling his longline at 0200, using the hydraulic longline spool mounted at the starboard rail of the Christiana's working deck. The first 40 minutes of the haul were uneventful. He retrieved 23 halibut in the 6 to 40-pound range, gaffed each one, and cleared the hooks for the return of the ground line to the spool. The deck log he kept during solo operations was a small spiral-bound notebook mounted beside the spool control, and it is the only written record of what happened on the Christiana that night. The notebook was recovered from the vessel in 1992 when Ivanof sold her to a Homer-based fisherman named Ray Kolchuk, and it is currently held at a private collection, along with the Christiana's wheelhouse door. The log entry at 0240 reads, in Ivanof's Russian-accented cursive, spool weight increasing. Not a halibut. The next entry, at 0243, reads, not a sea lion. The last entry of the night, at 0245, is a single word underlined 3 times, face. What Pete Ivanof did not know at 0245 on the morning of February 11th, 1991, and what he would not learn until he heard Captain Voss speak 12 years later, is that the creature he was about to see had been documented in a single withdrawn academic paper, published 18 months before his encounter. Dr. Elena Kazakov's 1989 review of anomalous Pribilof Canyon bycatch reports, the paper that had been quietly pulled from the Journal of Marine Biology and Ecology in 1991 at the request of its co-authoring institution, contained a specific prediction in its final section. Dr. Kazakov had noted that the morphology described by the Lindsay Marie crew, the combination of primate arm structure, webbed hand architecture, and cetacean tail morphology, was not, in her professional opinion, consistent with a localized Pribilof Canyon species. It was consistent with an abyssal species operating across the entire North Pacific continental shelf system. Her paper predicted that additional sightings, if they occurred, would cluster along deep-water shelf breaks and tidal current, channels between the Aleutians and the Gulf of Alaska, the exact category of environment that describes the Shelikof Strait Basin. Dr. Kazakov retired from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 1996. When she was contacted in 2011 by a reporter for an Anchorage Alt Weekly, she declined to comment on her 1989 paper, except to confirm that the withdrawal had not been her decision, and that her department chair had informed her at the time that the withdrawal request had come from a federal source. She did not name the source. She also declined to confirm or deny that she had been aware of the 1991 Shelikof Strait incident. But the geographic distribution of reports in her 1989 paper included Shelikof Strait on a map of predicted sighting clusters. Pete Ivanof was fishing directly inside one of the marked circles. Ivanof was hauling gear at the starboard rail when the weight on the spool increased beyond what he could account for with known species. Pacific halibut in the Shelikof Basin occasionally exceed 200 pounds, and a large halibut on a single hook is a known haul event. But the resistance on the line that night was not consistent with a halibut. It was not pulling. It was riding the line up. Ivanof cut the hydraulic spool and leaned over the starboard gunwale with a battery flashlight to see what was coming up with his gear. The Shelikof Strait water that night was, in his words on the 2003 recording, the color of old motor oil, and still in a way that winter water is never still. The flashlight beam fell onto a face approximately 4 feet below the surface, pressed against the dark green hull of the Christiana, and looking directly up at him. The face did not move when the light hit it. Ivanof described it on the tape as the face of a young man, a boy maybe 19, 20, except the eyes were wrong, and the skin was the color of a body that had been in cold water for a long time. The eyes, he said, were completely black, not dark brown, but black like a hole punched in the face of a coin. The hair was long and dark, and floating on the surface of the oily black water in a halo around the head. The creature was holding itself stationary against the hull of the Christiana, with one hand pressed flat against the steel of the rub rail at the waterline. Ivanof said the worst thing about the moment was not the face. The worst thing was that the face was not hiding from him. It was studying him. On the 2003 recording, Ivanof described the next 8 seconds as the longest time of my life that was not actually long. He backed away from the gunwale. He walked. He said it was important to note that he did not run. The 12 steps across the wet working deck from the starboard rail to the wheelhouse door. He entered the wheelhouse. He closed the door behind him. He engaged the interior deadbolt, which was a recent installation. He had added it himself in the summer of 1990, after a minor theft incident at the Kodiak docks. He killed the exterior deck lights from the breaker panel at the helm. He killed the interior wheelhouse lights, except for the green and amber glow of the instrument panels. And then, for the first time in the 5 years, he had operated the Christiana alone in winter waters. Pete Ivanof got on the VHF radio and broadcast a distress call. The Coast Guard radio log from Kodiak Station captured the call at 0312 on February 11, 1991. It is a real Coast Guard record, and the audio file was obtained under the 1999 Freedom of Information request. The full text of Ivanof's broadcast, transcribed from the Coast Guard recording, reads as follows. Kodiak Station, this is FVV Christiana, Shelikof Strait, approximately 18 miles southwest of Cape Kodiak. I have a person on my deck, and it is not a person. The Coast Guard dispatcher on duty, a petty officer 3rd class, whose name is partially redacted in the released transcript, requested Ivanof to repeat and clarify. Ivanof did not respond. The radio log shows that the Christiana's VHF remained open on the distress frequency for the next 14 minutes, during which the dispatcher requested a response 23 times, but no further transmission was ever sent from the vessel. At 0326, the dispatcher logged the call as suspected equipment malfunction or operator, distress, and dispatched a Coast Guard cutter from Kodiak toward the Christiana's last known position. The cutter did not reach the vessel until approximately 0930, more than 6 hours after the initial call. By then, according to Ivanof's 2003 testimony, the creature had been on his deck for the entire duration and had departed the vessel under its own power 40 minutes before the cutter arrived. During the 6 hours between 0312 and 0847 on the morning of February 11, 1991, Pete Ivanof remained inside the wheelhouse of the FV Christiana with the door bolted, the lights off, and the radio silent. He has described those 6 hours only once, in the final 19 minutes of the 2003 recording. The creature, he said, did not leave the vessel. It moved deliberately across the working deck, from the starboard rail where it had come aboard to the port side, and then back again, in what Ivanof described on the tape as the way a man walks the room of a house he is thinking about buying. He could see the creature's movements through the rectangular window above the helm. The wheelhouse window on the Christiana was a single pane of marine-grade safety glass, approximately 30 inches wide and 18 inches tall, ice-rimmed along the edges and streaked with the salt spray of the hull. The creature approached the window 3 separate times during the 6 hours. The first approach was at approximately 0340 by Ivanof's estimate, roughly half an hour after he had bolted himself in. The creature sprawled on the wet deck directly below the window and raised its head to look at him through the glass. Ivanof said it did not blink. He was unable to determine whether it had the biological capacity to blink. The second approach was at approximately 0520. This time, the creature pressed its left hand flat against the exterior of the glass and held it there for what Ivanof estimated as 11 minutes. He watched a halo of condensation spread outward on the inside of the window from the point where the hand was pressed against the outside. He watched the webbed fingers spread wider against the glass as the pressure increased. He watched the dark points at the fingertips, the claws, Voss had described 12 years earlier on the Lindsay Marie, make contact with the safety glass without scoring it. The glass did not crack, but Ivanof said the pressure was steady enough and the hand was close enough that he could see individual pores in the pale gray skin of the webbing. The third approach was at 0731. By that point, Ivanof had been awake for 23 hours and had not moved from his position at the helm for more than 4. The creature came to the window again, but this time it did not press against the glass. It tried the handle of the wheelhouse door from the outside. Ivanof heard the handle turn. He heard it turn twice, slowly, with a deliberate mechanical motion that was not the motion of an animal batting at a piece of ship's hardware. It was the motion of something that had watched the handle and understood what the handle was for. The deadbolt held. The creature did not attempt the door a second time. At approximately 0715, before the third window approach, the creature did something that Pete Ivanof said he had thought about every day for the 12 years since. It went over the side of the vessel briefly, the hydraulic groan of the Christiana's. Gunnel rigging was audible through the wheelhouse bulkhead, and returned to the deck less than 90 seconds later with something in its hand. Ivanof watched through the window as the creature crossed the deck and approached the wheelhouse door. It did not look up at the window. It lowered its head and placed the object it had retrieved from the water carefully onto the wet steel of the deck, directly in front of the wheelhouse door, approximately 18 inches from the base of the door. The object was a single Pacific staghorn sculpin. A staghorn sculpin is a small, spined, mottled brown-bottom fish found throughout Shelikof Strait in winter months, typically 6 to 8 inches in length, not commercially valuable, and considered by longline fishermen as incidental bycatch. The sculpin the creature had retrieved from the water and placed on the deck was dead when it placed it there. Ivanof could see that much from the window, but it had not been dead for long. It had been caught within the previous 2 minutes. The creature placed the sculpin precisely on the wet deck, adjusted its position once with one clawed finger, and then withdrew 3 feet from the door and sprawled on the deck in a position from which it could watch both the door and the sculpin. It did not move from that position for the next 32 minutes. Pete Ivanof, inside the wheelhouse, understood in that moment that the creature was not attempting to attack him. The creature was offering him food. Ivanof said on the 2003 recording that he has spent 12 years trying to understand what that gesture meant, and that he has not arrived at an answer he can live with. He said the worst possibility is the one that kept him awake most nights. The worst possibility is that the gesture meant exactly what a gesture like that would mean between 2 human beings. At 0847 on the morning of February 11, 1991, according to Ivanof's testimony and the Coast Guard's subsequent reconstruction of the incident, the creature rose from its position on the deck, crossed to the stern of the Christiana, paused briefly at the transom, looked back once at the wheelhouse window, and dropped over the side. Ivanof did not open the wheelhouse door for another 2 hours. When he finally did, the sculpin was still on the deck in front of the door, exactly where the creature had placed it. He did not touch it. He radioed the Coast Guard cutter that was by then approaching his position, told them the situation was resolved, declined medical assistance, and refused to allow them to board the Christiana for inspection. The cutter escorted the Christiana to Kodiak Harbor without boarding. Ivanof sold the Christiana to Ray Kolchak in July of 1992. The sale was documented. The vessel changed hands, and the log notebook was transferred with the boat because Ivanof had forgotten it in the wheelhouse drawer where he had kept it. Kolchak retrieved the notebook from the drawer, read the February 11th entries, and kept the notebook in a cardboard box in his garage in Hover for the next 19 years. In 2011, during a refit of the Christiana, Kolchak also removed the wheelhouse door from the vessel and replaced it with a newer aluminum model. The original dark green steel door bore 4 parallel vertical gouges, approximately 3 feet up from its base, scored into the painted steel beside the handle. Kolchak had noticed the gouges when he purchased the boat in 1992 and had asked Ivanof about them. Ivanof had said only that the gouges had been there when he took delivery. This was not true. In 2011, Kolchak retained the original door and donated it, along with the log notebook, to a private collector of Alaskan maritime artifacts in Homer. The collector commissioned a metallurgical analysis of the gouges in 2012. The analysis was performed by a retired materials engineer at the University of Alaska Anchorage. The engineer's report concluded that the 4 gouges had been scored into the painted steel by a pressure edge tool with a hardness rating in excess of the Rockwell. See scale for untreated carbon steel, meaning, in plain English, that whatever had made the marks was physically harder than the door itself. The engineer's report did not speculate on the identity of the tool. It noted only that the spacing between the 4 gouges was consistent with the width of 4 human fingers. The 2003 recording of Pete Ivanof's testimony runs for 29 minutes and 14 seconds. It ends with Joan Merrick asking him why he had come to the festival that night and why he had chosen to speak on the record for the first time in 12 years. Ivanof's answer is the last thing on the tape before the recording ends. He said that he had been waiting since the morning the cutter escorted his boat back to Kodiak for someone else to say it first. He said that he had known from the moment the creature placed the sculpin on his deck that whatever was in the Shelikof Strait had been moving through those waters for a very long time, probably longer than there had been human beings in the North Pacific to see it, and that it had almost certainly been encountered before. He said that when his cousin in Dutch Harbor mentioned Captain Voss by name, and mentioned that Voss was going to speak about something that had happened in the Pribilof Canyon in 1984, he had understood immediately that the waiting was over. He said he had come to Kodiak to find out whether Captain Voss had felt the vibration in his teeth. He said that when Voss described the vibration at the 34-minute mark of his own recording, Ivanof had known that he was not alone and had never been alone. He thanked Joan Merrick for turning the recorder back on. He asked her not to play the recording for anyone for at least 10 years. She honored that request. Pete Ivanof died of a massive stroke on November 9, 2007, at the age of 54, in a hospital in Kodiak, with his wife and 2 grown children at his bedside. Joan Merrick's DAT tapes from the 2003 Kodiak Crab Festival were deposited in the archive of the Alaska Humanities Forum in 2008, 6 months after her own retirement, and they remained uncatalogued until 2019, when a graduate student named Marisol Chun digitized the archive as part of a master's thesis project on commercial fishing oral histories. Chun flagged the Voss and Ivanof recordings for her thesis advisor within a week of the digitization. The recordings have been publicly available for research purposes since 2020. They have never been broadcast. They have never been formally acknowledged by any federal agency. The Freedom of Information request that produced the 1984 Lindsay Marie materials was never extended to cover the 1991 Christiana incident because the requesting researcher did not know the 1991 incident existed until she was contacted in 2021 by a documentary producer who had heard the Chun digitization. The researcher has since filed a supplementary request. It has not, as of this recording, been fulfilled. 2 Alaskan captains, 12 years apart, in 2 separate bodies of water, separated by more than 400 nautical miles of open Gulf of Alaska, each encountered a creature they could not identify and could not forget. Neither man spoke publicly about his encounter until the other man did. Both encounters produced physical evidence that still exists. The deformed rebar frame of king crab pot 13 in a Coast Guard storage facility whose location has never been disclosed. The 4 gouges in the wheelhouse door of the FV Christiana in a private collection in Homer. The 3 photographs taken on the deck of the Lindsay Marie, 2 of which Captain Voss placed on a table in Kodiak in 2003 and 1 of which he did not. The Coast Guard distress recording from 0312 on the morning of February 11th, 1991, in which a solo longliner in the Shelikof Strait transmits a single sentence about a person on his deck who is not a person. And the DAT tapes themselves, 47 minutes and 29 minutes of testimony from 2 men who finally said it out loud to each other in the back room of a Kodiak bar on the evening of May 24, 2003. The scientific record offers no classification for the creature both men described. The morphology is consistent with a convergent evolution pathway in which primate architecture develops alongside cetacean adaptations, a pathway that has no fossil precedent and would not be expected to leave one given the preservation conditions of abyssal marine sediment. Whether the creature encountered by Captain Voss in 1984 and the creature encountered by Pete Ivanof in 1991 were the same individual, or 2 members of a small population moving between the Pribilof Canyon and the Shelikof Strait across a time frame of more than a decade, is not a question that can be answered with the evidence currently available. What can be said with certainty is that 2 men, independently, describe the same creature, the same pale gray skin, the same long dark hair, the same webbed hands with dark claw tips, the same long gray-green tail ending in split flukes, the same smooth face of a young man, the same all-black eyes, the same sub-bass vocalization that they both felt in the bones of their jaws. And both men described something else that the scientific framing has not yet accounted for. They described a creature that watched them, that studied them, that made decisions, and that, in the case of the Christiana, brought a gift to the door of a locked wheelhouse and waited 32 minutes to see whether the man inside would come out, whether what they encountered was an undiscovered deep-water species, a relict hominid lineage surviving in the North Pacific abyssal zone, or something taxonomy does not yet have a framework to classify, remains officially undetermined. The tapes are in the archive. The photographs are in a Dutch Harbor Credit Union safe deposit box that has not been opened since Captain Voss's death in 2011. The door is in Homer. The deformed pot is somewhere in a Coast Guard storage facility. The creature, if the evidence is to be believed, is still out there. If you know of other incidents from the Bering Sea or the Gulf of Alaska between 1970 and 2005 that match the morphological descriptions in this report, we would like to hear from you in the comments below. And if you want to see the additional evidence files as they become available, subscribe to Maritime Incident Files.